Welcome to session 44 in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. In this session, we are going to be looking at the short stories of Cordwainer Smith, all bound together in this omnibus volume, The Rediscovery of Man, and at his single novel published under that name of Cordwainer Smith. We'll see why that matters in a bit, called Ursula. And I want to take a little bit of time to talk about what we're actually doing here in the series. So this began in 2016 as a in-person, face-to-face talk series hosted by the Brookfield Public Library. And the general idea was that we would meet each month and interested participants would come. I would give a bit of a lecture and lead some discussion about classic speculative fiction authors, so that includes fantasy, sci-fi, horror, alternate history, cyberpunk, all sorts of other genres that fit in there as well. And it actually took off quite well after an initial session talking about the idea of world building and how we distinguish fantasy from science fiction and other genres. There were a lot of interested participants, and we jumped in with sessions on J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and A. Van Vogt, and it just went from there. And we didn't meet every single month. There were a few where there were things that arose that got in the way, but for the most part, we would generally get in 11, sometimes just 10 of them per year. And it continued on for 5 years. This is year 5. The only thing that actually brought us to a halt was the COVID-19 pandemic. So the last session that we met was, I believe, in either February or March of 2020. And we haven't met since then. And people have been asking me, hey, are you going to start the series again? And I thought, well, the only way that that's going to happen is like this, online, with me talking to the camera and into my microphone and sharing some of the things that I find really great about these classic and contemporary authors with you, and then engaging with the audience through various means. So as you're watching this, if you're one of the very first people watching this, you are participating in a premiere where I am on there chatting live with you as you watch this. You can, leave questions or comments and I'll respond to them. And then after each of these online sessions, we're also going to have a video conferencing session using Zoom that people have to sign up for in advance. And then they can talk with me in a more unstructured manner, not quite face-to-face, but virtually face-to-face in a sort of sci-fi way using Zoom. And we're going to go over this stuff for maybe another, hour or 90 minutes. I'm going to try to keep these videos, which I'm hoping to put out once a month in a new series of Worlds of Speculative Fiction, continuing this on in this virtual way. I'm going to try to keep these to about 90 minutes. So in all of the previous sessions, if you've been watching them, there's a few basic things that we do. I usually begin by talking about the importance of the author and a few little tidbits, and sometimes about how I came to read them and appreciate them. Quite a few of the authors are those who I'd read previously and wanted to go back to, but a lot of the authors are people who were suggested to me by members of the let's call it reading group there in Brookfield, or by my online interlocutors who've watched these videos and got in on votes and wanted to make suggestions. And so I'll usually talk about what my general impressions were, and then we'll talk a bit about the biography of the author in the case of Cordwainer Smith, a.k.a., well, actually, we should say a.k.a. Cordwainer Smith, because his real name is Paul Linebarger, and he actually published under several other pseudonyms. We're going to talk a bit about his biography, and then one of the key aspects of all of these Worlds of Speculative Fiction series talks is narrative worlds, world building. What kind of universe does this person create in their prose? In the case of Cordwainer Smith, mostly in terms of short stories, all unified under this vast rubric that we can call the Instrumentality of Mankind. And then we launch into a number of philosophical themes. I don't know exactly how many I'm going to discuss in this session. I'm going to just keep going until we run out of time, because I do want to keep this at 90 minutes so that we can have, after that, the much more intensive video discussion using Zoom. So let me begin by talking about Cordwainer Smith, Paul Linebarger. One thing that's kind of cool about him biographically is when I went to look him up at first, it turns out that he is a Milwaukee native. So he was born right here. I'm not even sure exactly what street he was born on. It might not be that far from where I'm shooting this here in downtown Milwaukee right now. Now, saying that, he did not remain a Milwaukee resident. As a matter of fact, you can call him kind of a citizen of the world. His mother had him here so that they would have American citizenship for him, and then very quickly, young Paul was doing all sorts of things all over the place. He spent time in different boarding schools. Myself, I encountered Cordwainer Smith, the main author name that he wrote under, through encountering a story that really gripped me when I was, I would say, in middle school. And, as I've said in many other of these talks, my great-uncle Herbert, there were two things that were really interesting about him that play a role in my own development as a reader. One was that although he really didn't have much formal education, he actually had to drop out of school in elementary school to begin working because he was one of the oldest boys in his rather large and poor family. He was one of the best read people that I knew, and he really enjoyed what we nowadays call speculative fiction, this broad swath that covers fantasy, utopian stuff, horror, all the way over to hard science fiction. And the other thing, there's one other aspect of that. Uncle Herbert would not only read a lot himself, he took a great interest in everybody else's reading, and so he really promoted it. The other thing was he had a library in the basement of the prefab house that he and his wife, my Aunt Tunny, built after they retired, and they moved out of Chicago and they moved to northwestern Indiana along with my grandpa and grandma and one other uncle and aunt, Uncle Ernie and Aunt Betty. And the basement was relatively unfinished, but he put up all these massive bookshelves. And actually, it must not have been him who put it up. It was probably some of my uncles who did carpentry quite well, because Uncle Herbert apparently was not a great carpenter. And he filled these bookshelves with all sorts of stuff. Sometimes they were things, there'd be a place that he knew that was closing, and they were getting rid of their books, and he'd grab them all. And he had a lot of science fiction and fantasy books. Well, one of those science fiction and fantasy books, and I don't even know which one it was, had a story in it by Cordwainer Smith. And it's the same story that so many other people, when they talk about how they first started reading Cordwainer Smith, it's the same story. It's the Game of Rat and Dragon, which is this amazing tale of how humankind is going out into the stars and encountering some, evil force that just wants to destroy humans, and a interesting alliance that develops between human telepaths and house cats, ordinary cats that turn out to be instrumental in saving humanity out there in the stars. And it was such a brilliant story, told so well for reasons that we're going to get into when we get into the themes, that I just sort of fell in love with Cordwainer Smith's writing. And it sort of stuck in the back of my head. And then when I encountered some of his other stories later on, like The Ballad of Lost Camel or Scanners Live in Vain, I didn't quite make the connection, but I recognized something that I really liked about it. And then later on down the line, when I was older, I started reading Cordwainer Smith. I think basically I found a book in the library, and it wasn't this volume, it was a smaller one, because there's several different volumes that have gathered at least some of his stories. And I started reading my way through it, and I was like, well, this is brilliant stuff. So when it came time for Series 5, Year 5 of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction, I wanted to make sure to get this guy, Cordwainer Smith, in there. He has been quite influential on many other science fiction and fantasy authors, not least because of the quality of his prose and the breadth of his ideas. You can see some interesting commonalities between his Instrumentality of Mankind and a few other similar sort of developments in other sci-fi authors that are thinking about this long span of human history and some similar themes. I would say Iain Banks, the Culture series, in a way is indebted to that. I would also say Gordon Dixon's Dorsai is kind of going along the same kind of lines as well in thinking about the nature of humanity out there in the stars and how we remain human and how we continue to develop. But that's one of the philosophical themes that we're going to get into. What else is there to say about the importance? Well, I suppose one way to tell that you've really made it as an author is they create an award named after you. And there is indeed a Cordwainer Smith award out there. So you can tell that within the science fiction or broadly speculative fiction community, he is held up to a high degree of respect. I think one of the things that you can say is everybody probably wishes that he had written more than what we've got here, given what he had to say. And indeed, he had planned to write more. So that's a fitting place to stop and leave that as a little tantalizing hook for you. Cordwainer Smith, of course, was not the author's real name. His actual given name was Paul Myron Anthony Linebarger, a good German name, right? Coming from this area where he did have some family roots. And he did, in fact, write not only under the pseudonyms of Cordwainer Smith, but several others. Anthony Bearden for his poetic works. He also wrote as Felix C. Forrest and Carmichael Smith. He wrote novels under those names. But Cordwainer Smith is the science fiction moniker that he went under for all of these really interesting, interconnected stories that compose the Instrumentality of Mankind series. And he is, indeed, as we mentioned, born here in Milwaukee. His parents did that deliberately so that he would have American citizenship. His dad was a retired federal judge from the Philippines who got interested in the Chinese Revolution and actually played an important role in funding it. So by 2 years before Paul is born, this is going on. His dad is over there and getting heavily involved. And interestingly enough, if you know your Chinese history, Sun Yat-sen is a really important figure, right? Well, that was, I'm just going to call him Cordwainer Smith from this point on. I'm not going to switch between the two names. That was Cordwainer Smith's godfather. So, you can tell that his father was really quite involved there. And he got bounced around quite a bit. He went to about 30 different schools at different points. And something actually quite catastrophic happened to him early on. He was at a boarding school in Hawaii, and this is in 1919. He was born in 1913, so he was probably 6 years old at the time. And the stories are kind of vague about exactly what happened, but there was some sort of accident, and one eye wound up being completely destroyed, and the other eye ended up getting a bad infection. So he was almost blind for quite some time. He never did, of course, get the other eye restored because it was so damaged, and he had to wear a glass eye, which he would sometimes pop out later on in classes when he wanted to surprise people. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. So he moved around quite a bit. His parents also did as well. They were involved in all this stuff going on over in China, but young Cordwainer Smith, or Paul Linebarger, was going from country to country to country as well. And he ends up eventually going to George Washington University. And by 1932, when he's 23 years old, so this is actually, he's quite an achiever to do this. He graduates from Johns Hopkins, a place where he's going to be connected with later on, with a PhD in political science. And, again, he's quite active, moving around all over the place. By 1937, he becomes a professor at Duke University. And that'll continue on to about 1946. When World War II happens, he becomes a second lieutenant and works in the Office of War Information. And this is where you could say he officially starts to become involved in espionage and intelligence and all these other overlapping things. As a matter of fact, Paul Linebarger is going to become one of the most important people in what we later on call psychological operations, or psyops. He'll write a classic book about that in 1948 called Psychological Warfare, which is still in print and still read by quite a few people. And in 1943, he gets sent over to China. And the goal there is for him to work with military intelligence to help, build things up and carry out operations. Now, if you know much about the Asian war going on, that's involving China, Japan, quite a few other countries, as well as World War II kind of spirals out, you know that it doesn't really have that great of an ending for the nationalist Chinese. But, for the time being, Linebarger is involved with that. And in 1945, he's going to return from China. He takes a desk job. He's still also officially a professor at Duke until 1946. And at that time, he's going to write one of his first stories within this universe. It's not one of his first stories. He'd written quite a bit before that. But the first story in the Instrumentality of Man, and that's, Scanners Live in Vain. And we'll talk a bit about that story in particular, I think, in a few minutes, because it is worth singling out as a really important story. But he sends it out to all these different places. They all reject it, these sci-fi magazines. As a matter of fact, one of the things that is really funny about it, that some of the commentators have brought out, is that it was rejected as being, quote, too extreme. So you wonder, you think about the sci-fi at that time, and you read that particular work. Well, what's so extreme about it, right? But that's what goes on. And it doesn't actually get published until 1950. We'll talk about that in just a moment. While he's involved in the war in China, he rises to the rank of major, and eventually he's going to sort of muster out and go into the reserves. He joins the faculty of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., and there he's an East Asian specialist officially, East Asian studies, right? But he's also carrying out this sort of clandestine psyops training and teaching for CIA agents at the same time. And that's where the story about popping out his glass eye comes from. One of the points that he wanted to make to classes that oftentimes would meet in his house, sort of under wraps, was that you have to be prepared for surprises. And so, he would do that. He'd pop it out and say, "See, here's a surprise for you right now." Eventually, he's going to rise to the level of colonel. He does a lot of military advising. During the war, he's advising Chiang Kai-shek, who, if you know, again, your Chinese history, the nationalist leader, eventually has to move to Taiwan and is really the founder of the early state there. And he also advises the British in Malaysia about their insurgency operations that are happening, and the United States in Korea. He doesn't get involved in Vietnam, which is kind of interesting. He seems to have thought that Vietnam was not a particularly good place to be involved in by comparison to, say, Korea or the British in Malaysia. And he advised John Kennedy on some matters, offered those classes in psychological warfare, as we mentioned. And that book, Psychological Warfare, comes out in 1948. So he's got a lot of things going on at the time. He's married to two women at different times. In 1936, so, he shortly before he becomes a professor at Duke, he gets married to Margaret Snow. He has two daughters with her. The marriage doesn't survive, and they actually divorce in 1949. In 1950, he gets married to Genevieve Collins and would remain married to her the rest of his life. They are buried next to each other. She survived him by about, 15 years or so. He dies in 66, and she dies in the 80s. What else do we need to say about him? He dies of a heart attack in Baltimore. He spends a good bit of his time traveling different places and learning about what's going on there and advising people. But Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, that whole area really became his stomping grounds, you could say, which makes sense for somebody who is as closely involved. I suppose there's a few other things to say about him biographically. So one of the things about the Korean War that gets brought up in the stories, and I think this is a great narrative about the kind of person that he was. There were a lot of Chinese troops who were attempting to surrender to Americans, but one of the big stumbling blocks to surrendering is this sense of losing face, of having to give in, be a loser and lose some of your identity by doing that. And so one of the things that Linebarger did that was really quite humane was he came up with a way of talking in Chinese. It's basically stringing together a few words, the words for love, the word for virtue, and the word for humanity. And said in the right way, they sound in Mandarin Chinese like a person is saying in English, I surrender. Like, the word I, love, right? And so I don't know exactly what the rest of it was, but he had these turned into leaflets, and he had this broadcast to across the Chinese lines. So when they were surrendering, they could, in their view, be saying, I love virtue and humanity, and Americans could hear them saying, I surrender, and everybody could get along without killing anybody any further in this really bloody and terrible war. I think that's kind of emblematic of who this guy was. He was a person of conflict, of war, of deception, of, using psychological tricks to beat your opponent. But he also is somebody who stood for saving lives, for love, for humanity. And both of these sides fit together. And there's so many characters in his works where this is also the same. Some of the lords and ladies of the Instrumentality, some of the other important characters. Another thing that does fit into his work that I think is important to talk a little bit about. So he was raised what we call a high church Episcopalian. So Episcopalians are Protestant Christians within the Anglican spectrum or Anglican tradition, right? The Church of England, they became Episcopalian after the American Revolution here. And they were usually upper class in America. And they retained a lot of the Roman Catholic ritual, so much so that Anglicans have often kind of positioned themselves in between other Protestants and Catholics. And to be high church means that there's a lot of focus on ritual and sort of the communion thing as opposed to a more evangelical approach. And this shows up in his works, not as Christianity being sort of thrown in your face or anything. There aren't even really a lot of allegories like there are with, say, C.S. Lewis, even though Lewis is quite inventive with what he does with the allegories, particularly in, for example, the Space Trilogy. Instead, Christianity becomes the old, strong religion, and there are people who are transmitting it in the stories, and there are also like what we could call virtuous pagans in the stories as well, who may encounter it and may not. Linebarger himself also had an interest in Coptic Christianity, the Christianity of Egypt, and wrote some sketches for stories later on that would have Copts, like a planet that had Coptic Christians on it and robots, and there's an interesting thing going on there. The other thing that I'll mention too, since we're getting into his stories now, is that the next really big story for him was The Game of Rat and Dragon. And I mentioned that Scanners was rejected. So in 1950 it was published in a book called, or a review called Fantasy Book, which was not a particularly highly regarded series. It didn't last very long. Frederick Pohl, however, had another piece in there in the same issue that Scanners Live in Vain was in. And he remembered it and got it republished later on. And then Linebarger winds up publishing, as Cordwainer Smith, The Game of Rat and Dragon, and then a whole bunch of other ones. And there's a nice little thing about this in this edition with the story copyrights, where it tells us where each of these was published. And you could say that Linebarger's publishing career is really going from about 1955 to 1966 as Cordwainer Smith. He'd published other things before as these other authors. So if you look at some of these really important ones, for example, The Lady Who Sailed the Soul, 1960, published in Galaxy, Queen of the Afternoon, gets published posthumously in 1978. Game of Rat and Dragon, published in 1956 in Galaxy. Burning of the Brain, October 1958. From Gustable's Planet, that's a really funny one. If you haven't had a chance to read that, you definitely want to. 1962. And it goes on, and there is actually one other thing to say about this. So Linebarger, once he gets writing these Cordwainer Smith stories, and remember too, he doesn't have to make money as an author. He's already, working as a professor, as kind of a trainer of spies and psyops people. He's published other things. He's publishing these things because he wants to. He had notebooks. There were actually several notebooks. He had notebooks in which he had all these ideas kind of spelled out for himself. He'd keep adding to it. And there's two different stories out there about how he lost the first notebook, which then, it's sort of like there's a story about a musician who had been using a voice recorder to record all these riffs, and he had like 5 years worth of riffs on there, and the voice, he didn't back it up anywhere, always a bad idea. And it like fell out in the toilet or something like that, and the voice recorder got destroyed. You couldn't get the data off of it, and he was like, "Oh, I lost all these riffs," Well, that musician had to begin from the start. Linebarger apparently lost this notebook in which there were all these other like ideas for stories in that universe that were spelled out or at least sketched out. And then he said, I'm just not going to do any more of these, and so that was it. It was really he was working on these things until the end of his life, though, in one way or another. So the two stories are: one is he's supposed to have left it at a restaurant. The other is it's supposed to have fallen out of his pocket while he was fishing on a lake. Who knows whether any of these are true? But it turns out that, we know this from his daughter, he did have another notebook that had other ideas. So he didn't actually stop, and he continued on. This is like where the idea about the Coptic planet comes from. She's got a website where she's published quite a few things about him and other people's recollections of him. So that's enough about his biography. Let's talk now about the universe that he created. One reason why I call this the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series is because we do indeed focus on the world building that goes into the series of stories or novels or whatever it may be that the author who we're discussing sets out. And in this case, obviously, we're talking about Cordwainer Smith and the Instrumentality of Mankind. So there is a massive narrative coherence in these stories that are being told, largely in this volume, and they're set in you could say a sequence that spans millennia. So they're all after our time, quite a bit after our time, actually, and he's got some interesting speculations about what's going on. The very early stories in the narrative sequence, not necessarily in the order of being published, do make reference to some of the countries and cultures that we can identify with. For example, the Chinese in the story about how they took Venus when the people fell, right? Or the war fought between Tibet and America in the little war story, when war has become this sort of like strategic maneuvering thing that people do. And there's some discussion about how the Americans crisscrossed an entire continent with highways that you can still see, at least at some point in time. But for the most part, it's all happening in a future for humanity in which the human race is developing in certain ways. And that's one of the key themes that we're going to talk about. And I guess you could say that something that's absolutely central to the narrative universe that Cordwainer Smith is setting out is humankind reaching out to the stars and to space. So there are a number of planets that wind up being at least mentioned in the course of it. Not many of them are actually explored at any length, but they're at least being referenced or discussed. Great example of this is the Douglas Uying planets, right, which are said to they orbit their sun or circle their sun in a single cluster, and so being able to chart out the geometry, the physics of what's going on with them is supposed to be particularly complex. So there's that going on. There's obviously old Earth playing an important role. There's other Earths that wind up getting called Earth in some of the stories. And then there's a number of other worlds that are populated. And quite a few of these worlds will require considerable adaptation by the human being just to be able to live on them. And we're going to talk about the different kinds of people in just a few minutes. But those are called hominids. They don't look quite like human beings anymore, although quite a few of the worlds do, in fact, try to stay as close to human shape as they possibly can while adapting to the difficult environments that they're facing. One of the planets that plays a particularly important role and is mentioned not just in this novel itself, Norstrilia, but also in another really great story called Mother Lytton's Little Kittens, right? And it's this place that has been settled by North Australians, and we should talk about that world. So they actually they run across something that changes their lifestyle, but they decide not to allow it to change their lifestyle. So they originally are sheep farmers living on this kind of tough planet, right? And the sheep are just gigantic, and there's this this fungus that grows on them that's called strewn. And this strewn winds up playing an incredibly important role in the cosmos because it's an immortality drug. It allows human lifetimes to be extended far beyond what medical science was capable of the time, lives of maybe 180 years, 200 years, almost indefinitely, so that people could live to be 1,000 years. And so this makes them incredibly rich. On their planet, one of the things that they do in order to retain their culture and not lose who they are is they institute a set of price controls. So, basic foodstuffs and things along those lines, tools, very cheap. Any sort of luxury, incredibly expensive. So much so that some Nostrilians will go off-world, not just for vacations where they can enjoy these things, but to live permanently, because that way they can actually spend their incredible wealth. Whereas on Nostrilia, they can spend it if they want to. Like, you can buy a, extremely expensive handkerchief that, you can wipe your face with. But there's not much point to it, so it discourages all of that sort of stuff. And that's where some of the important characters in these stories, including, of course, this guy, Rod, who plays such an important role in this, the boy who bought the planet Earth, right? Well, here's a great sum up of this. What's Nostrilia like? Someone once sing-songed it up like this. Gray lay the land, gray grass from sky to sky, not near the weir deer, not a mountain low or high, only hills and gray. Watch the dimpled twinkles blooming on the star bar. That is Nostrilia, right? All the muddy glubbery is gone, all the poverty, the waiting and the pain. People fought their way away from monstrous forms. People fought for hands and noses, eyes and feet, man and woman. They got it all back again. Back they came from daylight nightmares. Centuries when monstrous men sucking the water around the pools dreamed of being men again. They found it. Men they were again, far away from a horrid wen. All right? And there's also a nice line here, actually, about Mother Hitten's little kittens wait for you down there. Little pets they are, little pets, cute little things they say. Don't you believe it? No man ever saw them and walked away alive. You won't either. That's the final flash. That's the ultimate cobber. And Mother Hitten's little kittens are actually these genetically modified minks who are, used to telepathically broadcast their murderous rage out into space, essentially possessing and taking over anybody who wants to come to Nostrilia without having proper permission, and causing them to fight and kill. So that's one of the interesting worlds. There's another world that's talked about later on, Xanadu, which is framed a little bit as if it's like Nostrilia, only it has a different sort of devotion, obviously, to pleasure, right? And in that story, the Down to a Sunless Sea, they talk about how Xanadu was created. Here we go. One of the characters says, "No underpeople here. I think we're the only planet in the Instrumentality that doesn't have underpeople except for Nostrilia, of course. But the reasons for Nostrilia and Xanadu are at the opposite ends of the spectrum. We enjoy our senses. None of that nonsense about hard work building character like the Nostrilians believe. We don't believe in austerity and all that malarkey. We just get more sensual pleasure out of our unmodified animals. We have robots to do the dirty work." So there's some clear conception of worlds as places where a certain ethos reigns. And, if you've read other science fiction authors who do similar world building, you can say that there are worlds, where there's like a deliberate choice to live a certain way, and that's the mindset of it. It doesn't just happen that way. Great example of that would be Gordon Dixon's Dorsey novels. Another one that comes to mind for me is Orson Scott Card's novels following Ender's Game, when human beings go out into space, and there are different planets that are devoted to different things and even have their own particular religious attitudes, something that Cordwainer Smith is going to talk about quite a bit. There's also another planet called Sheol, and this is a planet that's originally set up as sort of a punishment planet, but in some respects it doesn't wind up really functioning like that in the same way that people imagine that it would. And this is in a story called A Planet Called Sheol. What happens is those who are condemned by the instrumentality wind up being sent there, and they're genetically modified so that things grow out of them, all sorts of organs. And the growth is, of course, incredibly painful, so they're given these really hardcore drugs while they're doing it. They also have the possibility of these caps that they can put on that go directly to their pleasure center as well. And so the people there live a kind of screwed up existence. They have, that's right, supercotamine, named after the new French town where they developed it. The chemist hooked in one more hydrogen molecule that gave it a real jolt. If you took it in your present shape, you'd be dead in 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes would seem like 10,000 years of happiness on the inside of your mind. And so, this is actually a underperson telling them about this, a bull underperson. So the interlocutor says, what's the use of it then? And so Bedicat says, well, you can take it after you've been exposed to the dromazoa outside this cabin. You get all the good effects and none of the bad. And the people who've been exposed to the dromazoa, they grow all these things coming out of their bodies, which are then harvested. So they're in effect being turned into organ-generating creatures. And they live out their lives there, more or less forgetting who they are and what they are, until the instrumentality actually shuts that entire operation down. What else? There are 3 other planets that are in the stories. Each of them has names, but it's good enough just to name them by the particular names given in the stories' titles. There is the Gem Planet, and the Storm Planet, and the Sand Planet. And what's tying all 3 of these together is one character who is seeking revenge on the tyrant who's occupying his world, which is the Sand Planet. And he meets the rulers of each of these planets and interacts with them and grows in the process. It's one of the few really continuous narrative character elements that I would say Cordwainer Smith has in this millennia spanning narrative that he's actually setting up, where you have one character who's in a number of stories. The other character who, of course, would be similar to that would be the underperson, the Catwoman, Kamel. But she's not playing exactly quite the same role as this guy is. And those 3 stories are bundled together and sold as a set in a book. But of course you can find them, here in this set of novels. There is one other thing to say about Old Earth in terms of the planet. In quite a few of the stories, there are these places in Old Earth that are fairly unregulated, or, at least there isn't this sort of like surveillance and overseeing happening all the time. And so one of these places is called the Gebet, and also has another place called the Berserk. And very interestingly, one of the people who's living there describes it as there are no rules, but there are understandings among those of us who live down here. And this is actually a good place to talk about some of the other themes that pervade this narrative universe. So there's really, I would say, 2 main things that we need to talk about. And we're going to look at these as philosophical themes in just a few minutes in a bit more detail. So we can talk about the planets people are living in, but the settings for a lot of the stories are actually out in space. So space itself is one of the settings, and that means that the ships that human beings are living on and traversing space with, those are part of the settings as well. So I think that's equally important within all of these stories. The other thing that I think we do need to mention is the structure of society and this notion of the instrumentality and the different people who live there. So the instrumentality of humankind are people who actually do have the power to intervene. They engage in some sort of like governing, but not really governing. There's all these local powers and institutions, but the instrumentality, it's not an empire, it's not a republic, it's actually, if we want to think about it, it's kind of like a presbytery, right? If you think about the Reformed or Presbyterian churches and the way that they organized themselves, there was a set of elders, presbyters, right? And they were self-selecting and self-reproducing by choosing new members to join in. In this case, it's the lords and ladies of the instrumentality. They're all, sort of high-talent individuals, some of whom have a long-standing family connection with this, and they engage in decision-making and ruling and can engage in all sorts of major, not just world-changing, but humanity-changing reasonings and decisions. They also carry out some of the exploration as well. So they're the ones who you could say make of things what they are. And they're all humans. And then there's I mentioned the hominids out there in space who sometimes come to old Earth. Then there's robots. There's lots and lots and lots of robots. And robots don't have the same rights as human beings. As a matter of fact, there's mention in some cases of like they cannot touch a human being without their permission. They can't handle a homunculus, right? And then there are the underpeople. And the underpeople have been created by human beings from animals. And they don't have the same rights as human beings. As a matter of fact, they're treated as if they are sort of analogous to robots. And all of these people are living within this vast system of stars and planets and space routes that Cordwainer Smith is presenting us with. There are a number of great philosophical themes that are raised and sometimes even discussed in Cordwainer Smith's novels. Very often the discussion is happening in the mouths of characters who are presenting stuff. It's sort of like what Philip K. Dick or Ursula K. Le Guin will do. Instead of exposition on the part of the narrator, the characters carry out these deliberations and discussions. We may not be able to get to all of them because I really do want to keep us on track as far as time in order to make room afterwards for the video conferencing discussion with those who are interested in carrying out more conversation about this. And I'm not going to present these necessarily in order of importance, but more in a convenient order that allows me to keep my thoughts straight, because there is so much going on in Cordwainer Smith's mind. As a matter of fact, I'm going to use a metaphor from some of his stories to talk about what we have here in these novels as a way to start. So, he's trying to imagine, as science fiction authors have to, what the technology for robotics and artificial intelligence and all these other associated things will actually look like. And he's writing at a time sort of like, again, we use Philip K. Dick as an example, though Dick lived considerably longer than Smith did. at the time that Smith was writing, they were starting to exploit what could be done with electronic circuits. So you'll see him talking about like relays and things like that. We don't talk in those terms anymore because we're used to thinking in terms of solid state electronics, and who knows what things are going to be like, 150 years from now. So Smith has robots, and the robots in his stories have some kind of programming. That's part of what makes them robots. And the programming is very often going to involve some samples of brains from animals. So, for example, in the story Think Blue, Count 2, there's a mouse brain that's used for a particular robot in a really interesting way. But there's also robots that have human minds imprinted on them as well. So in here we go. In the Dead Lady of Clowntown, the dead lady is in fact a robot who has had a lady of the Instrumentality's mind imprinted on her. There's several others as well. 3 to a Given Star, 3 different things, a ship, a robot, and then sort of a device, each of which has a human personality imprinted on it. Also, their bodies have been taken along to be re-imprinted. And so, this is, even the scanners live in vain. Okay, they're not actually doing robotics with people. They're turning people effectively into cyborgs. There's this really interesting idea about being able somehow to convey not just information, not just data, but human responses, human personalities. So I said I was going to use a metaphor. That's kind of what Cordwainer Smith is doing with these books, with these stories. We're getting so much of the mentality, or at least one side of it, of this incredible complex character, Paul Linebarger, a.k.a. Cordwainer Smith, through just this amount of stuff. So imagine, even more imprinted upon people. So that's a fitting place to start. Let's jump into talking about the instrumentality of humankind, or mankind, if you want to say, and what's going on with that. So there is an earlier instrumentality that occurs in in the narrative earliest stories. The instrumentality, by the way, is just sort of a shadowy thing being hinted at in the first big story, which is, Scanners Live in Vain, and even in Game of Rat and Dragon as well. But in these stories, Mark Elf, where the Vomocts are going to actually appear, and emerging from this human dark age, right? Queen of the Afternoon. There is an instrumentality that is like holding back the true men from any further development. And so they want to be able to beat them and bring about a sort of, let's call it a renaissance of humanity, which means that we then can go out to the stars. That's right. So it was the people that they are going to try to fight against are the Jwins. And he says, they were Chinesians, philosophers. Now they are the true rulers of the earth, and we, so they believe, are merely their instrumentality, their police force. Their power is not over the body of man, but over the soul. That is almost a forgotten word here now. Say mind instead. They call themselves the perfect ones and have sought to remake man in their own image, but they are remote, removed, bloodless. They have recruited persons of all races, but man has not responded well. Only a handful aspire to the kind of aesthetic perfection the Jvins have as their goal. So the Jvins have resorted to the knowledge of drugs and opiates to turn true man into a tranquilized, indifferent people, to make it easy to govern them, to control everything they do. Unfortunately, some of our descendants have joined them. So we have an instrumentality that's a police force for this shadowy group of once were humans, but now no longer are, but they're calling the shots. And the human beings rise up and effectively revolt against them and take charge of their own destiny. And then we have this entire, succession of stories. Scanners Live in Vain, The Lady Who Sailed the Soul, Think Blue, Count Two, the game of Rat and Dragon, where planoforming is becoming what's going on, The Crime and the Glory of Commander Sudzal. And what's happening through all of this is that the instrumentality is carrying out its work and doing so generation after generation. Now, they have a lot more continuity possible, of course, because they, once the drug strewn is discovered, they can live for a very long time, right? The Dead Lady of Clowntown, I mentioned. Somebody asks her, are you a person or are you a machine? And she says, I'm a machine, but I used to be a person. A lady, in fact, and one of the instrumentality. But my time came and they said to me, would you mind if we made a machine print of your whole personality? It would be very helpful for the information booth. So, of course, I said yes, and they made this copy, and they shot my body out into space with all the usual honors. But here I was. And then she says, so what do you say? Am I me or aren't I? And then, there's all of this discussion that happens later on. The reason why this omnibus is called The Rediscovery of Man is in part because they managed to get themselves, and when I say themselves, I mean the human race managed to get itself, even with the instrumentality, into a kind of sterile utopia. Everything going along quite well. The best story, I think, for summing that up is Alpha Ralpha Boulevard. Kind of a funny name right there. So let me turn to that little discussion. Comes after the Little Kittens. And there's a great introduction to what is happening and why it's happening at that time, and then we can go back to some of it. I'm going to read this passage. We were drunk with happiness in those early years. Everyone was, especially the young people. These were the first years of the rediscovery of man, when the instrumentality dug deep into the treasury, reconstructing the old cultures, the old languages, and even the old troubles. The nightmare of perfection had taken our forefathers to the edge of suicide. Now, under the leadership of the Lord Jessicost and Lady Alice Moore, the ancient civilizations were rising like great land masses out of the sea of the past. And so, why are they doing that? Why are they reveling in all of these things? Governments, money, fear, death. Well, because without those things, life starts to become sterile. And humanity effectively reaches a dead end. Here's a great line about the instrumentality that I'm going to read to you, just to give you a sense about how they operated. You have to understand the pattern of the instrumentality to see how it happened. This is in the story Drunk Boat. The instrumentality was a self-perpetuating body of men with enormous powers and a strict code. Each was a plenum of the low, the middle, and the high justice. Plenum, a fullness, right? Each could do anything he found necessary or proper to maintain the instrumentality and keep the peace between the worlds. But if he made a mistake or committed a wrong, then it was suddenly different. Any lord could put another lord to death in an emergency, but he was assured of death and disgrace himself if he assumed this responsibility. The only difference between ratification and repudiation came in the fact that the lords who killed in an emergency and were proved wrong were marked down on a very shameful list, while those who killed other lords rightly, as later examination would prove, were listed on a very honorable list, but still killed. With 3 lords, the situation was different. These 3 lords made an emergency court. If they acted together, acted in good faith, and reported to the computers of the instrumentality, they were exempt from punishment, though not from blame or even reduction to citizen status. 7 lords, or all the lords on a given planet at a given moment, were beyond any criticism except that of the dignified reversal of their actions should a later ruling prove them wrong. This was all the business of the instrumentality. The instrumentality had the perpetual slogan, watch but do not govern, stop war but do not wage it, protect but do not control, and first survive. So this gives you a sense of the scope of their power and what they're doing and why they're engaged in all of this sort of stuff. Under Old Earth gives us some additional stuff as well that I think is quite helpful. This is where the Lord Stow Odin, who is close to the end of his life, is proposing that they need to have this rediscovery of humankind. The Stow Odin says, our population is dropping on most worlds, including the Earth. People have children, but they don't want them very much. He goes on and he says, most people want happiness. Good, we've given them happiness. Dreary, useless centuries of happiness in which all the unhappy were corrected or killed or adjusted. Unbearable, desolate happiness without the sting of grief, the wine of rage, the hot fumes of fear. How many of us have ever tasted the acid, icy taste of old resentment? That's what people really lived for in the ancient days, when they pretended to be happy and were actually alive with grief, rage, fury, hate, malice, and hope. These people bred like mad. They populated the stars while they dreamed of killing each other, secretly or openly. Their plays concerned murder or betrayal or illegal love. Now we have no murder. We cannot imagine any kind of love which is illegal. Can you imagine, here's something I mentioned, the Merkins with their highway net? Who can fly anywhere without seeing that net of enormous highways? Those roads are ruined, but they're still here. You can still see the abominable things quite clearly from the moon. Don't think about the roads. Think about the millions of vehicles that ran on those roads, the people filled with greed and rage and hate, rushing past each other with their engines on fire. They say that 50,000 a year were killed on the roads alone. We would call that a war. What people they must have been. And so he goes on, and the others say, oh, things are just fine. Stow Odin says, people really don't care about their lives. We need to restore something to humanity. And so, we've got the instrumentality as such, which is this really interesting conception. They've got their code that they're following. And then we've got this open question. Well, what is it to be human? What is it to be fully human? Is it something that can be effectively managed? Or is it something that has to be allowed to kind of run wild? So that's one really important philosophical theme, this governance that we see in the instrumentality, and their interest in making sure that humanity remains humanity and doesn't become something else. That's a good segue into talking about the case of the underpeople. Another thing that is really central for the stories of Cordwainer Smith. Who are the underpeople? As I mentioned, before the underpeople, there was actually the unauthorized men, which were animals that remained animals, but were given a kind of humanity to them in terms of intellect and also maybe in terms of some of their desires. And they play a role in those very early things. But eventually, the underpeople are developed, and the underpeople are animals that are changed in significant ways. So a cat who will have a C in front of his or her name, or a dog with a D, or a turtle with a T, right? They all wind up being taken as embryos and turned into effectively hominids who have all these capacities. With the dogs, you have a real sense of loyalty. There's a very important dog figure named Joan, who is, sort of a stand-in in some respects for Joan of Arc, but also for perhaps Martin Luther King and others as well. There's, of course, Camel, the cat. I'm going to talk about cats quite a bit in just a few minutes. And there's many others who play a very important role as well. The under people don't have rights. As a matter of fact, in some respects, they live more vitally than the human beings do because their life could be taken away from them at any point in time. They are treated as if they are robots, and yet they feel and think, and in some cases actually have more to offer than humans do. So let's take a look at the Ballad of Lost Kamel, because there's some really interesting discussion going on there, both of Kamel herself and also by the Lord Jessicast. And as a matter of fact, there's here's a great line that I wanted to point out, going back to the rediscovery of man. Ever since mankind had gone through the rediscovery of man, bringing back governments, money, newspapers, national languages, sickness, and occasional death, there had been the problem of the underpeople, people who were not human, but merely humanly shaped from the stock of earth animals. They could sing, speak, read, write, work, love, and die. But they were not covered by human law, which defined them simply as homunculi and gave them a legal status close to animals or robots. Real people from off-world were always called hominids. Those are the people who've adapted to things and are originally of human stock. Now, it goes on and it says, most of the underpeople did their jobs and accepted their half-slave status without question. Some became famous. Kamel's father, Kamacintosh, had been the first Earth being to manage a 50-meter broad jump under normal gravity. His daughter, Kamel, was a girly girl, earning her living by welcoming human beings and hominids from the outworlds and making them feel at home when they'd reached Earth. Now, here's something that they observe that's really quite interesting. Before I get to that, though, there's another thing that's important. Human beings and hominids had lived so long in an affluent society they did not know what it meant to be poor. The lords of the Instrumentality had decreed that underpeople derived from animal stock should live under the economics of the ancient world. They had to have their own kind of money to pay for their rooms, their food, the possessions, the education of their children. If they went bankrupt, they went to the poorhouse, where they were killed painlessly by means of gas. So it was evident that humanity, having settled all of its own basic problems, was not quite ready to let earth animals, no matter how they might be changed, assume a full equality with human beings. Kamel, who works at the spaceport, knows human beings better than many human beings do. And she's also used as sort of a conduit for this messianic underperson, Tekeli, who is able to speak directly to Jessicast, and who also plays a role in Australia as well. One of the key themes that's being developed is the liberation of the underpeople in the Ballad of Lost Kamel, in Australia, in the Sad Lady of Clowntown, and several other of the stories. Now, I mentioned this Lord Jessicast. Jessicast was one of the few true men who believed in the rights of the underpeople. He did not think that mankind would ever get around to correcting ancient wrongs unless the underpeople themselves had some of the tools of power, weapons, conspiracy, wealth, and above all, organization with which to challenge man. He was not afraid of a revolt, but he thirsted for justice with an obsessive yearning which overrode all other considerations. When the lords of the Instrumentality heard there was the rumor of a conspiracy among the underpeople, they left it to the robot police to ferret it out. Jessicast did not. He set up his own police, using underpeople themselves for the purpose, hoping to recruit enemies who would realize that he was a friendly enemy and who would in course of time bring him in touch with the leaders of the underpeople. So, this is a very important thematic running through it, this working for the acknowledgement, the rights of a vast number of people who do in fact serve humankind and are elevated from their animal status to, I would say, a human status by human beings, but who then are not treated as fully human by them. There are turtle people who have incredibly long longevity and are used on these ships to just stand there and wait for something to happen. There are dog people and bull people and all sorts of other animal people as well. And this is something that I think reflects the humanity of Cordwainer Smith. This again, we have to remember that he is somebody who saw struggle happening across the planet. He lived through and participated in World War II, the Korean War, these insurgencies that were taking place. He saw people struggling for civil rights, decolonialization, all of these things, and he wove it into the fabric of this incredible story. So I also did want to mention one other thing. There's some interesting discussions out there about not just animals, but cats and the role that they play for Cordwainer Smith. So I'm going to do a little bit of a digression here. Obviously, we have the cat woman, Kamel, in the Ballad of Lost Kamel, who plays a really important role, and she also turns up, of course, in Australia and a few other ones, Ralpha Boulevard, right, where she saves one of the main characters. But there are some other places where cats are brought up. And I'm going to get to probably the most important one in just a bit, which will also be a segue into talking about space. In Down to a Sunless Sea, there is a gigantic cat named Griselda, who is the steed of the Lord of the Instrumentality, who comes there and is investigating things. And Griselda is a gigantic cat. They've just bred them super big and they can ride them. I'm going to read you one passage about her. Griselda seemed to sense the pleasure at her long, effortless bound. Suddenly the ride took on a new proportion. Overhead, the ornithopter, which had brought the Space Lord to Xanadu, passed on its way back to the spaceport. At once, Griselda left the pride and leapt futilely after the ascending ornithopter. As she attempted to bat at it, Kamal was forced to use both hands on the holding ring in order to not fall off ignominiously. She continued to leap and bat hopelessly in its direction until it disappeared from sight. Then she sat down to lick herself and inadvertently her passenger. So, what we've got there is this wonderful description of cat behavior on the part of this cat that has been turned into a steed. And unfortunately, Griselda dies in the story. And Kamal is very upset by this because he's come to feel a love for her in the process. There's another really great story, the Crime and Glory of Commander Sudzal. Commander Sudzal he's exploring space. And what happened in this is, there are genuine aliens who they encounter. And then there's all these human beings that went out into space and then essentially got lost track of. And one of these races becomes completely male. And they find ways to reproduce, and they become quite a dangerous race. The problem is that the planet that they're on, all the women eventually develop cancer, and any females who are born will do so. And they become a really dangerous set of people. Commander Sudzal jumps there, and they find him. Here we go. Arakosia, right? Now, what he does to deal with this is he commits a crime. I'm going to read this to you. So, here we go. Rules for ordinary times, for ordinary places, for understandable dangers. This is a nightmare cooked up by the flesh of man, motivated by the brains of man. Already his monitors were bringing him news of who these people were, these seeming maniacs, these men who'd never known women, these boys who'd grown to lust and battle, who had a family structure the human brain couldn't accept, could not believe, could not tolerate. They're breaking into his ship and they're going to get back to Earth. So what does he do? Here's the description. Sudzal committed a crime. It is the pride of the instrumentality that the instrumentality allows its officers to commit crimes or mistakes or suicide. The instrumentality does the things for mankind that a computer cannot do. The instrumentality leaves the human brain, the human choice in action. The instrumentality passes dark knowledge to its staff, things not usually understood in the inhabited world, things prohibited to ordinary men and women, because the officers of the instrumentality, the captains and sub-chiefs and the chiefs, must know their jobs. If they do not, all mankind might perish. Sudzal reached into his arsenal. He knew what he was doing. The larger moon of Arcosia was habitable. He could see there were earth plants already on it and earth insects. So what did he do? He had strange resources. He had twins or quadruplets of almost every earth animal. The earth animals were carried in tiny capsules, no larger than a medicine capsule, and consisted of the sperm and ovum of the higher animals, ready to be matched for sowing, ready to be imprinted. He also had small life bombs, which could surround any kind of life with at least a chance of survival. He went to the bank and got cats. 8 pairs, 16 earth cats. Felis domesticus, the kind of cat that you and I know, the kind of cat which is bred, sometimes for telepathic uses, sometimes to go along on ships and serve as auxiliary weapons when the minds of the pinlighters direct the cats to fight off dangers. We'll talk about that in just a moment. He coded these cats. He coded them with messages just as monstrous as the messages which made the men-women of Arcosia into monsters. This is what he coded. Do not breed true. Invent new chemistry. You will serve man, become civilized, learn speech. You will serve man. When man calls, you will serve man. Go back and come forth. Serve man. These were imprinted, as he says, on the actual molecular structure of the animals. Then Sudzal committed his offense against the laws of mankind. He had a chronopathic device on board the ship, a time distorter to be used for a moment or a second or two to bring the ship away from utter destruction. What he does is he sends the cats back 2 million years. He flung the cats into the nameless moon of Arcosia. Then the cats, having been evolved for those, millions of years, they come. Their ships glitter to the naked sky. Their little combat craft attack the cats who had not existed a moment before, but who had 2 million years in which to follow a destiny printed into their brains, printed down their spinal cords, etched into the chemistry of their bodies and personalities. The cats had turned into people of a kind, with speech, intelligence, hope, and a mission. Their mission was to reach Sudzal, to rescue him, to obey him, and to damage Arcosia. So that he's created this entire race. A little bit later on, he says the cats are still there. Perhaps the instrumentality knows where they are. Perhaps the instrumentality does not. It is against all law to bring up a form of life superior to man. Perhaps the cats are. Perhaps someone knows whether the Arcosians won and killed the cats and added the cat science to their own, or whether the cats won. Perhaps the cats are imprinted by a strange mission, by weird hopes of serving men they don't recognize. So, this is quite an interesting way of understanding cats as well. These hyper-evolved cats who, again, were bred to serve humankind and did so. There is one other very important story, of course, that discusses cats. And that is the one that I mentioned as the first one that I read, which was the inroad for so many other people. And that is the game of Rat and Dragon. And here we go. In it, there is this incredibly great discussion, and very brief, but so poignant, of this pinlighter. Now, pinlighters are people who are telepaths, and they fight against these beings that exist out in space who would destroy human beings if they could. And we're going to talk a bit more about that in a bit. And it's happened while human beings are doing what's called planoforming, which is a way of like bending space that allows them to do faster than light travel and go between the stars. So Underhill, the character, is talking about all these different things that are going on, and then he talks about the partners. So there's a lottery that's being carried out. Which person is going to get paired with what cat? And you might say, oh, cat? Why? Well, here's the description. Usually the partners didn't care much about the human minds with which they were paired for the journey. The partners seemed to take the attitude, human minds are complex and fouled up beyond belief anyhow. No partner ever questioned the superiority of the human mind, although very few of the partners were much impressed by their superiority. The partners liked people. They were willing to fight with them. They were even willing to die for them. But when a partner liked an individual the way, for example, that Captain Wow or the Lady May liked Underhood, the liking had nothing to do with intellect. It was a matter of temperament or a feel. Underhill knew perfectly well that Captain Wow regarded his, Underhill's, brains as silly. What Captain Wow liked was Underhill's friendly emotional structure, the cheerfulness and glint of wicked amusement that shot through Underhill's unconscious thought patterns, and the gaiety with which Underhill faced danger. The words, the history books, the ideas, the science. Underhill could sense all of that in his own mind, reflected back from Captain Wow's mind as so much rubbish, right? And so Captain Wow is kind of this cool cat who goes along and helps them fight against the dragons. Dragons for human beings, rats for the cats. I'm going to read you what the cats actually do. Man and partner could do together what man could not do alone. Man had the intellect, partners had the speed. The partners rowed their tiny craft no larger than footballs outside the spaceships. They planoformed with the ships. They rowed beside them in their 6-pound craft ready to attack. Picture these cute little cats in their little tiny space bubbles. The tiny ships of the partners were swift. Each carried a dozen pinlights, bombs, no bigger than thimbles. The pinlighters threw the partners, literally threw, by way of mine-to-firing relays directly at the dragons. What seemed to be dragons to the human mind appeared to the form of gigantic rats in the minds of the partners. Out in the pitiless nothingness of space, the partners' minds responded to an instinct as old as life. The partners attacked, striking with a speed faster than man's, going from attack to attack until the rats or themselves were destroyed. Almost all the time, it was the partners who won. So Underhill is a telepath. And he, in this case, is actually riding along with the Lady May. Here's how the Lady May is described. The Lady May was the most thoughtful partner he'd ever met. In her, the finely bred pedigree mind of a Persian cat had reached one of its highest peaks of development. She was more complex than any human woman, but the complexity was all one of emotions, memory, hope, and discriminated experience. Experience sorted through without benefit of words. When he had first come into contact with her mind, he was astonished at its clarity. With her, he remembered her kittenhood. He remembered every mating experience she'd ever had. He saw in a half-recognizable gallery all the other pinlighters with whom she'd been paired for the fight. And he saw himself, radiant, cheerful, and desirable. He even caught the edge of a longing, a very flattering and yearning thought. What a pity he is not a cat. And there's, during the story, they both end up being injured. He winds up being in the hospital at Caledonia. And, the doctor is saying things to him. And the doctor says, "What kind of cat did you have out in front of you?" Underhill then says, "Don't call our partners cats. The right thing to call them is partners. They fight for us in a team. You ought to know we call them partners, not cats. How is mine?" And he says, "Well, I'll find out for you." And then he says, "I can sleep. I just want to know about the Lady May." And the nurse joined in. She was a little antagonistic. "Don't you want to know about the other people, the passengers?" He says, "They're okay. I knew that before I came in here." And then he says, he stretched his arms and sighed and grinned at them. He could see they were relaxing and beginning to treat him as a person instead of a patient. "I'm all right," he said. "Just let me know when I can go see my partner." And the nurse actually turns around and says, "You pinlighters, you and your damn cats," right? And it ends with this. "She is a cat," he thought. "That's all she is, a cat." But that was not how his mind saw her. Quick beyond all dreams of speed, sharp, clever, unbelievably graceful, beautiful, wordless, and undemanding. So there's this really, quite startling discussion of cat nature, you could say, and its possibilities. And, you can say that Cordwainer Smith's books are trying to understand the human condition and its possibilities, but he's doing that also with animals, and perhaps no more with cats more than any other species. And we could speculate about that. My time is getting short, so I want to talk about at least one other big philosophical theme before we cut to an end. And I would say that is the going out into space. Space itself, in so many sci-fi series, is treated as something essentially neutral. You move around in space, you fly around in it, you go from planet to planet, star to star. There may be interesting anomalies in space, but there's nothing about space itself that is going to be difficult other than the time that it takes to traverse it and the loneliness of being out there. Scanners live in vain. Why do the scanners have to be cut? Why do they have to undergo the procedure that they've undergone? Well, it's because of the pain of space. So, here we go. He's being cranched, which means that he's actually being given the cranching wire that allows him to have sensations again. And he says, all except for the sudden red stinking roar of coming back to his senses, coming back across the wild threshold of pain. The scanners have been turned effectively into, here we go. He tried to remember the days before he'd gone into the Haberman device, before he'd been cut apart for the up and out. He'd always been subject to the rush of his emotions from his mind to his body back to his mind, confounding him so he couldn't scan. But he hadn't been a scanner then. And so Scanners Live in Vain is actually about these men who have undergone this procedure to allow them to be able to take other people out into space. And space is something that is hard, something that hurts, something that one has to deal with in that way. Then eventually they find another way to do things. And in Scanners Live in Vain, there's a struggle between the scanners who want to kill the person who's come up with this knowledge and the people who want to save them. The next way of moving through space is through these gigantic sails that capture radiation and allow ships to go a great distance, but it's still slower than light speed. So human beings have to be able to be at sleep for a long ways. And, each voyage takes them an incredibly long time. Then we have planoforming. And planoforming is where the game of rat and dragon comes in. Why do they have to do this pin lighting? Well, let me read you what's going on. Dragons, that's what people call them. To ordinary people, there was nothing except the shiver of planoforming and the hammer blow of sudden death, or the dark spastic note of lunacy descending into their minds. In a fraction of a second between the telepath's awareness of a hostile something out of the black, hollow nothingness of space and the impact of a ferocious, ruinous psychic blow against all living things within the shift, the telepaths would sense entities something like the dragons of ancient human lore, beasts more clever than beasts, demons more tangible than demons, hungry vortices of aliveness and hate compounded by unknown means out of the thin, tenuous matter between the stars. So there's things between the stars and the dark spaces in space that will attack human beings. Planoforming and the pin lighting makes it possible for human beings to travel faster than light, but they also have to deal with these complications. The other thing that's being talked about is Space 3, and that just shows up in several different stories, and this allows like an instantaneous transfer from one place to another, but it requires human passion to make it work. So that's a fitting place to end all of these probably all too incomplete and tantalizing discussions about Cordwainer Smith and his amazing stories. I highly recommend that you read him, that you set aside the time and space to be able to really concentrate on these. You will be well rewarded.